the Catherine versus Meghan rivalry is sort of like Elizabeth versus Wallis 2.0. It almost was just taken as read that this time they wouldn't meet.
We have the potential for, a kind of rival Montecito household out there.
Yes, you do. That is a very real possibility.
Hello, welcome to Royal Exclusive. I'm Matt Wilkinson, The Sun's royal editor, and with me is royal historian and author Gareth Russell. Welcome, Gareth.
Thanks, Matt.
Let's go straight in. Now, the King and Prince William showed, a real kind of public display of unity this week with the unveiling of William in charge of the Army Air Corps. This massive contrast to his relationship that we've seen with Prince Harry in the last couple of weeks. How do we break this down?
Well, I think within the monarchy's framework, it's logical that it goes to Prince William. The King had it when he was Prince of Wales. He spoke about that. I think some people have seen it as a bit of a slight on the Duke of Sussex, but as he's no longer a working royal, I think it was always pretty natural that it would go to William. But I do think that point about how close the King and the Prince of Wales seemed and that very obvious affection between them, that was pretty palpable watching it.
Well, it's a thing. I mean, it goes back to the coronation.
Yeah.
When William, I think he kissed him on the cheek, and then the King, said thank you to his son. There's been, maybe lots of debate over the kind of years about the relationship between Charles and his two sons, or which one is the favourite. But it's the fact that William is the heir, isn't it? And William has to kind of fulfil the role, of backing up Charles. How do you think William is doing at the moment? Do you think he's really stepping up at the moment? Or?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think he is. I mean, look, I think many people will be aware of how difficult it is in any position, much less a public-facing one, when you have a loved one, in his case, two loved ones, dealing with cancer. But I do think we're seeing him more publicly visible, more publicly confident. And that transition from him being Duke of Cambridge and being second in line to first in line is quite a big one. I think it was always a kind of understanding that the second in line in that younger generation is given a bit more time for their family, because eventually that will be ceded to the public responsibility. So that's what you're seeing happen at the moment. And I suppose, also it's that what we saw this week really was also a moment of him standing next to the King, who has been out of public visibility for a while. So it was two different kinds of public visibility that you saw.
Now, you're obviously a historian, OK, which I'm glad I've got a historian on the show, because week after week we talk about the events, of the past week. I'd like to maybe go on a bit of an arc, a historical arc, and kind of compare what we've got here. The rivalry between William and Harry, OK, and the fact that the King seems to have snubbed his youngest son, and, William and the King are very cosy at the moment. We've seen this before in history, haven't we? We've seen kings fall out with sons and sibling rivalry. How does this compared to what's in the past?
I mean, this is sort of comparing this to some of the previous feuds is like comparing a good cup of tea to a shot of tequila. I mean, it's not really you look back on the 18th century royals, George II referred to his son as a monster. Queen Caroline, his wife, said the only consolation she had in dying was that she would never have to see the face of her son, Prince Frederick, again. So William and Harry's rivalry is fairly minor, and there was obviously civil wars in the Middle Ages. But if the benchmark is intense loathing and civil wars, it's quite hard to live down to that. In terms of the more modern royals, there have been tensions within the Windsors in the 20th century and into the 21st. The most obvious case would be George VI and his brother Edward VIII, or the ex-King Edward VIII. But part of what sets William and Harry apart, and I was sort of joking about, obviously, the sort of intense Hanoverian vitriol, but what sets Harry and William apart is this is the first time that we're seeing a real rupture within the royal family play out in the era of mass social media, and that makes it unknown territory for us. We've never really had a royal feud in which there are thousands, maybe even millions of people participating online and picking a side. And that's where it becomes trickier, even if they do reconcile, for them to win back people who've maybe invested in this argument online or personally.
That's really interesting because, as we're saying, there's an insatiable appetite for royals, and everyone's kind of got a dog in the fight, haven't they? I mean, people are taking sides, and we've got social media where everyone's got a point of view, where everyone's got a story. But in the past there would be sibling rivalry, but it would be fought out with armies or aides. Now it sits on Netflix or it's in books or there's rows, on documentaries on Netflix compared to what it happened in the past.
Yeah, it's less with sort of the Battle of Hastings, but it wasn't siblings, but it was distant relatives. It's more with hashtags, and yeah, it is tricky because, let's say for some reason Harry and William do reconcile, the damage done to both of their reputations by people who felt very strongly one way or the other, that will endure. It's kind of that thing, if it takes a second to say something in a lifetime to retract it. And so for both of them, it's a double-edged sword. It's also, I think, tricky for the monarchy when it's a symbol of unity to be disunited internally. Sometimes there's no choice. And certainly, George VI and Edward VIII, there really wasn't a choice after some of the decisions that Edward VIII made in the 1940s. I think recently we've come to understand that George VI and the future Queen Mother were right in their distrust of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. And actually, Edward VIII's collaboration with the Nazis went much further than we thought. So when you have someone who is sort of doing a deal with Hitler that he will replace his brother as king, it's quite difficult to send a warm Christmas card.
Yeah, I think we're on a different level now.
Yeah,
although Spare and
it's
Netflix,
not the same.
we're not on that level.
No, it's not. And I think sometimes people make this comparison between them. And yeah, it is. It's the last serious time you had brothers at odds. But in terms of what either William or Harry has done or has allegedly done or perceived to have done, it does not compare to some of the really bad and troublesome actions that have happened, particularly Edward VIII in the 1940s. So the comparison doesn't always stack up.
Yet.
Yeah.
We're only 4 or 5 years into this round. What I found interesting is that the King didn't meet Harry, but there was a lot of debate about it. So I think we wrote about the idea that Harry was keen to meet his father because he'd come over earlier this year and had seen his father after he'd announced he got cancer. But there was never any suggestion that the two brothers would come face to face, where there has been in the past when he's been over.
That's really interesting, and I think it's being picked up on that it almost was just taken as read that this time they wouldn't meet, which in itself, the silence tells its own story, doesn't it? The fact that for this time, no one expected the two of them to meet, and we didn't have any leaks coming from either camp that there was going to be a potential meeting or that one wanted it and one didn't. And that probably suggests that the rift is pretty firmly cemented by this stage.
Don't go anywhere because we have loads more coming up.
I don't think it's a surprise that we've heard the Duchess of Sussex, allegedly say that she wants to move on. But the public moves on slower than the personalities do. That the public were invited into this. I don't get the impression that he necessarily thought that the consequences of this would be as severe as they have been, or that it would land as badly with the public as it has. If you air your dirty laundry in public, it takes a lot longer for it to dry.
I know The Crown is fiction.
Sure.
But in the latest series of The Crown, one of my favourite scenes is when Harry and William are talking to each other and are talking about William potentially, ultimately becoming king.
Yeah.
I think William says, "I'll be William V." And Harry points out that William II, do you remember this scene where he said, William II had a terrible history because he was killed by his brother, also Prince Harry.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a kind of delicious little, little script in the...
Yeah, it is. So William II was out for a hunting trip and was hit by a stray arrow. And the theory goes that his brother, Prince Harry, who became Henry I, was just a little bit too quick to get to the treasury and lock down the capital. Whether that means Henry I is just really well prepared or knew something was coming, we don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's a good William and Harry, with much higher stakes.
Absolutely. And when Harry was over, when he was over in February, which I've got to commend him, to be quite frank, he knew his father had cancer, he wanted to come over and see him. The King didn't really want to see him. He was stopped from going to Sandringham. Is there anything historically comparable to that kind of situation where the King wanted to avoid his son?
Yeah, I mean, well, not his son, but I have to now look back on myself after saying you can't compare him to Edward VIII, and I will compare him to Edward VIII. Yes, so when Edward VIII, the ex-King Edward VIII, after he abdicated in 1936, he became Duke of Windsor. And when he would come back, sometimes for major events like his brother's death in 1952, other times for shorter visits, his estranged sister-in-law, who became the Queen Mother, made it, sort of said you had to be careful where you hosted him, and they would pick places where the royals had an out that they could leave at a certain point, because otherwise the Queen Mother's concern was that Edward VIII, or Duke of Windsor, sorry, would hang around like a bad smell and inevitably ask for an increase in his allowance. So they...
Well, this feels very similar to when Harry was over, to be honest. But that's just my view. The phrase was that, the aides were worried they'd never get rid of him when he was over.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so there is a direct comparison then. The Queen Mother used to say, try to pick somewhere where there's something, and not just that there would be another event, but that the royal actually had to leave the building that they were in, so that there was a clear and definite endpoint to the audience.
I hope this isn't a curveball, but just generally, what do you think about Harry's behaviour? Taking a step back over the last 4 or 5 years, what do you think about his behaviour towards his family, knowing what we've known over the past, 1,000 years of royal history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose for me, I always am slightly dubious of memoirs and of sit-down interviews, partly because I think they feel incredibly cathartic at the time, but you then want to move on. But you, in the public's mind, you're trapped forever like a fly in amber with these interviews and memoirs. And what you've said lasts much longer than the feelings that you had when you said them. And I don't ever really see an example in history of someone giving one of these interviews, and not just royalty, but celebrities and politicians, who have not become frustrated by its legacy. And for the Sussexes to have done so many so close together, I don't think it's a surprise that we've heard the Duchess of Sussex, allegedly say that she wants to move on. But the public moves on slower than the personalities do. The public were invited into this. And I think for him, one of the more surprising things that happened was that this man who, I always thought of as one of the great champions of privacy in the United Kingdom, and especially his family's privacy, then did reveal some very private conversations, including ones in the immediate aftermath of his grandfather's funeral. And that was very surprising to me that's what he chose to do. Purely conjectural on my part. But I don't get the impression that he necessarily thought that the consequences of this would be as severe as they have been, or that it would land as badly with the public as it has. Now, it's important to note there are many people who were very moved by what the Sussexes said, in a positive way. There were many who were outraged or dismissive or sceptical. And I think a lot of people who saw those interviews and read it felt that he had betrayed his family, and some of them felt he'd betrayed the country. So that takes a lot longer to reconcile that. And there's an old phrase or something like, if you air your dirty laundry in public, it takes a lot longer for it to dry. And I think that's a little bit of what we're seeing. But I also think it's worth remembering, he was immensely popular before all of this, and I don't think anything really lasts forever. So you could see him win that popularity back.
Well, I think it's telling since Spare, he's never gone down that route again. Do you know what I mean? He's never gone down the talking about the family again. He's completely changed. And I remember someone at Buckingham Palace when the late Queen was still alive, when things were put into her mouth. So when she had a statement or when she said something, they said that these words last forever. So they're carefully crafted. Like, for instance, the recollections may vary.
Yes.
That kind of statement, or the annus horribilis, they know that when the Queen says something, it's going to remain. Yeah. I'd wonder whether Harry, when he sat down with his ghostwriter, maybe didn't really think about that. Well, but that's just me thinking.
No, well, he wouldn't have been encouraged to see it that way. If you're going into an editorial or publishing process, they're not going to be looking at this as something that is carved into the granite face of history. They're going to be looking at something that is in a memoir, and this is a market that is used to selling celebrity memoirs. And there will have been no one around him, I would imagine, who would have said this will last forever. Yeah. It's a different form of communication. And I think the difficulty is that he is someone who has a very prominent social position, and actually what he says will have impact beyond simply a memoir. But I think I hadn't thought of that. You're right, he has kind of pulled it back. And actually I think there were even interviews that he did with Anderson Cooper and was it Tom Bradby, he did them as well, where he kind of tried to pull some of the stuff back and said, like, we never said they were racist at all.
For many, it's too late, but let's see what happens.
Yeah.
One thing that Harry and Meghan have been doing, just moving on, is Nigeria.
Yes.
Loads and loads of pictures. We saw Meghan in so many outfits. I think someone counted up it's about £125,000 worth of outfits. I'm not a fashion expert, as you can probably tell, but I think, you know, she wanted to be photographed. She wanted to be seen. It wasn't a royal tour. Was it a troublesome trip, do you think, for the palace? Was it a successful trip for Harry and Meghan? What's your reading of this faux royal tour?
Yeah, it is. I mean, when is a tour not a tour? It's a bit like beauty's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? I mean, obviously, it's not an official royal tour, but it looks and acts like one. And there were moments that seemed quasi-official. You had the moment of God Save the King being played at public dinners, and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex standing for that. I think from their perspective, from the Sussexes' perspective, and particularly from the Duchess of Sussex perspective, it was a success. I mean, the headlines were, broadly speaking, overwhelmingly positive. I think there was a little bit of pushback in the Nigerian press, but that's sort of the exception that proves the rule. I think mostly the Nigerian media were very positive about the tour. Likewise in Britain, although, again, there were some questions asked. The palace, I wonder, would they find it troubling? I mean, I don't think they would ever want to see an alternative royal family emerging.
It's almost. They've set up the office of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex,
yes,
rather than calling it Archwell. You know, they still call themselves Archwell's the charitable foundation kind of side of things, but everything from them now is the office of.
Yes.
They've got their own coat of arms, and now they're going on a tour. We have the potential for, and we're talking medieval history or talking back in the past.
Yeah, the rival king.
We've got a kind of rival Montecito household out there.
Yes, you do. To all intents and purposes, that is a very real possibility. The problem for them, for the Sussexes, is that once you start doing anything like that, people become a lot more critical of what you do outside that. So things like commercial endeavours or quasi-royal tours, people put it under more of a microscope than they would if you were calling it simply the office of Harry and Meghan. It's interesting. I wonder, is it part of an attempt to pivot from, really some harsh headlines they've had in the last year or two? Is it maybe to go in a slightly more socially conservative direction and have themselves as sort of royals in exile, for want of a better word? I wonder, is that them acting on advice that people don't want to hear another interview or another criticism of the British royal family? So it's possible.
Well, it seemed to fit the royal blueprint, had all the hallmarks of tours that I've seen in the past, or definitely with Harry and Meghan when they were in South Africa and Australia. It kind of ticked all the boxes, and I wonder if, we don't know yet, but I just wonder if they must have plans for, if as you say, it was a success, they must have plans. They could do this in America. They could do, a tour of certain areas of America or other parts of Africa or Asia. Anyway.
Certainly, I mean, their popularity in America is pretty low at the minute. Right. That could change. Yeah. As I think public opinion, you always have to assume it's a bit of a roller coaster. But they absolutely could, and I think there's indicators that they will, to be honest, Matt, because you heard, them talk about what a great success it was for them. And they, obviously Archwell had some pretty negative headlines that weekend as well. So I think that, for them, the tours are probably something very welcome. And it does remind them and their supporters and sympathisers of that kind of star potential that Harry and Meghan had when they first started stepping out onto foreign tours. So I really would not be surprised if we saw more of these. The difficulty for them down the line, and not just for them, but specifically in this case them, will be if there are more and more quasi-official tours, the question of who pays for it will become trickier. And then they'll start to put her, as they do with all royal wives and royal women, the wardrobe will go under the microscope. There'll be the headlines will start to generate themselves. That's not to say that they shouldn't do it, but I do think that they will get a different kind of press coverage, a lot of it more positive.
Stay tuned, because we have much more to come in the rest of the show. Here's a taste.
The Catherine versus Meghan rivalry is sort of like Elizabeth versus Wallis 2.0. In terms of modern royals living in America, having children who are prince and princess. I think there's going to be trial and error. Learning about the mechanics of monarchy from Elizabeth II must be like learning about music from Mozart.
One person we've not seen for a while is the Princess of Wales.
Yes.
Obviously, always on the show, we try, we send her our best. Where does you think she stands, like on the kind of historical arc that I keep referring to? Is there anyone in the past that we look back, or past or present or future or whatever, we look back and think the Princess of Wales has similarity in qualities or post or position?
Yeah, I mean, one of the few, when I really started out years ago, one of the things I sort of feel, thank goodness I got in there with an early prediction, is that I do think the Princess of Wales is very like the late Queen Mother, and maybe not necessarily in personality, but in terms of both of them. I mean, we forget, I think, the Queen Mother's been dead, 22 years. But the Queen Mother, in her lifetime, was an extraordinarily popular figure. I mean, even into the 1990s, she was outpolling Diana, sometimes as the nation's favourite royal. I remember when I worked in a biography of her, an American friend said, I don't think the Brits know that she died in such debt. And I said, no, they do know, just no one cared. They sort of just, it was, she was hugely, hugely popular. And part of the secret that she had was that she sees it as a marathon, not a sprint. And I do think Kate has that very clear long-term vision of, you don't sweat the everyday. You plan 5, 10, 15 years. And you don't really let yourself get dragged in too easily by the smaller details or the headlines every week. And that, as you say, is trickier in today's society than it would have been for the Queen Mother to do. But I also think the Princess of Wales I think she's tough in the best way possible. I use that as a compliment in the way I do with the Queen Mother. I think you have to be someone who is prepared to keep, to protect your private life, which the Queen Mother very much did with her husband and her 2 daughters, and also kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other and just keep going. So that, to me, is probably who I would compare it to. And actually, when I did the book on the Queen Mother, one of the people I interviewed who'd worked for the Queen Mum said they see very clear similarities between the two of them. And I think you kind of see a little bit of that in the way we've spun the Catherine versus Meghan rivalry as sort of like Elizabeth versus Wallis 2.0. It's
right.
We've sort of slotted them back in.
When you say Elizabeth, you mean the Queen Mother?
The Queen Mother, sorry, yeah. And I think, and that's not to say that the comparison is justified. I always sort of defend Meghan a bit and say, she's not doing...
Well, come on, this is pesky. We might as well get into it. If the Queen Mother, Elizabeth,
Catherine.
Is Catherine, Princess of Wales.
Yep.
She obviously was married to George the Sixth, and Edward VIII had abdicated over...
his American socialite wife, yes.
Over Wallis Simpson. His American socialite. Does that make... There have always been similarities between Meghan because they're American divorcees and they've kind of broken up a part of the royal family. Do you think it's justifiable, that?
Well, allegedly Prince Philip made the comparison, and he had met Wallis. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward and Wallis, did in the 1930s and again a little bit in the 1940s and 1950s is they did these very controversial quasi-royal, not royal tours.
Right. Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And I would have to be very, very clear before we go further. One of them was to Nazi Germany, and I am not drawing the comparison there. That's the most infamous one for very obvious reasons, because they were photographed smiling with Hitler.
Oh, yeah.
But there were other ones. They were sort of wined and dined. Again, this isn't great by Franco, but they did a couple of things in America, like you've been talking about with the Sussexes. They did have tours that aren't tours, that sort of rubbed the royal family up the wrong way, separating the German and the Spanish ones, which of the Spanish stay he had, because they were obviously much more politically incendiary. I think Wallis Simpson has 2 kinds of personalities, depending on which author you're listening to.
Right.
And in many ways are the 2 that we ascribe to Meghan. So separating the politics for a minute, Wallis is either presented as someone who was ambitious, loathed her sister-in-law, wanted to be the star player in the monarchy, was very, very difficult to work for, and essentially moved Edward away from being a working member of the royal family. The alternative view of her is that she was someone who never fully understood the monarchy and in many ways was sort of quite badly burned by it and by the British public's attitude towards it that she didn't quite fully process, and that essentially she was someone who dared to remold life on her own terms and to take the steps that she wanted to live, yes, as a duchess and a member of the royal family, a member of a relation of the Windsors, but that she did not want to feel necessarily shackled by that. And in many ways, and this is where I think it gets even more historiographically complicated, the best evidence that we have now, decades and decades after, the abdication crisis, there are letters that Anne Seba, who wrote a biography of Wallis, found from 1936, where Wallis is telling people she's very close to that she feels that Edward always wanted to get out of the monarchy and that actually she's sort of being used as the get-out ticket. So Meghan, in some ways, has been slotted into those two personality types, depending on which team you fall on. I tend to think culturally she's being made very similar to Wallis Simpson. I don't know if I buy that they're really that similar as personality types, to be totally honest. But that's from a biographer's perspective. I don't see as many similarities between Meghan and Wallis as I do between Catherine and the Queen Mother.
Well, the events are quite similar, aren't they, between
When I said them in that list, Matt, I was I was like, maybe I'm just directly contradicting.
You talked yourself into it.
I did. I actually I was like, oh, I'm actually arguing against myself here. Look, the events are not dissimilar.
I remember when Meghan appeared on Oprah Winfrey. I don't know if you remember the imagery there. She was wearing a
dress that was so like Wallis Simpson. Yeah.
And these things often aren't accidental.
No, they're not. Although you can kind of sort of extend that point and say, was there no one, there to say this is uncannily like a very famous photograph of the Duchess of Windsor? Maybe pick something else.
Well, I question how many people they have around them at the moment. I mean, there's been a situation recently, we probably won't touch on it much on the show today, but there's been a situation where they haven't filed paperwork.
Oh, this
and
is
and their delinquency order, and it's just they don't seem. I'm not entirely sure how planned a lot of the things the Sussex do, that is, because it does seem a little bit haphazard behind the scenes sometimes.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll give her a break on the dress, but the general kind of situation, the general kind of taking a prince, or some of the examples you gave there, I think it's right that people can compare to Wallis Simpson.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, one of the things about history is it is the great comparison. You'll always find something, and obviously for me, I like to see people getting involved with it. It's really interesting you say that about who do they have around them, and does it all feel a bit improvised? That does happen to royal families in exile. It's not quite what's happened to them. Although I'm probably about to talk myself back into it. But if you look at some royal families who had lost power, I'm thinking like the royal family of Italy in the 1940s and Greece after the 1970s. Sometimes some of the stuff that they do in the aftermath seems really short term and they haven't quite thought through how it will look. And that's possibly because they just don't have around them the team that they previously had. So it could be the Sussexes are struggling. There isn't really a roadmap for this, is there? I mean, there's been the universally disastrous example of Edward Wallis, but in terms of modern royals living in America, having children who are prince and princess, I think there's going to be trial and error with them, to be totally honest. And yes, I do think they could do with an advisor who has experience within the monarchy rather than just within America. But then it's a question of who would that be.
Royals and exiles. History, as you say, is the great... What was your phrase? History is...
Great comparison.
History is the great comparison. Is there any other royal figures that we can touch on that maybe compare to King Charles or maybe Prince William?
Yeah.
I think Charles has started off really well. I was saying this earlier. I think that I was worried about him when he came out of his cancer diagnosis. I was concerned that he'd taken on the job after, I think it was a record number of years. I can't remember how long now, but he had to wait until he eventually got the top job. And I was concerned that maybe his reign would be defined by by Harry, or by the kind of row with Harry and the division between his two sons, But I'm impressed currently by what he's doing. Is there anyone that you think reminds you of in history?
Two, I think, actually within sort of his not immediate family, but within the monarchy's immediate memory would be his grandfather, George VI, who he has spoken of quite a few times. Charles, actually, when he was a young boy, was in Sandringham on the day that George VI died. There's a sort of quite touching story about Queen Mother came into the nursery and was crying because her husband had just passed. And Charles came up and said, don't cry, Granny. And she explained that George had been found when the footman had brought in the tea. And Charles nodded and said, who drank the tea? That's kind of little things that children focus on. So he's always, I think, had very fond memories of his grandfather. And his grandfather did have to overcome things like a stammer, which many people might remember was really movingly dramatised in the King's Speech. Again, like The Crown, I know it's fiction, but it's a good movie and a good depiction of it. And I think he referenced George VI during his most recent visit to France. The other monarch I would compare him to is Edward VII, who sort of had this record, until Charles III, record-breaking stint as the Prince of Wales to a very popular mother with great longevity, Queen Victoria. And when Edward VII became king in 1901, there were concerns about his health in and around the coronation. In fact, in terms of having to replan a party, Edward VII's coronation had to be rescheduled a couple of days before it happened because his appendix burst. Right. So they went ahead with the meals that were being provided in working class neighbourhoods because all the food was there. But all the potentates and princes had to go home and they had to reschedule it to the next year. And a lot of people thought that it was the same thing that you're saying with Charles III and his battle with cancer, that Edward VII would be defined by illness. And he recovered remarkably, and his reign was short. It was 9 years. He died in May 1910. But he became immensely popular. And there had been concerns with Edward VII because of his life as Prince of Wales. He wasn't going to be suited to being king, and he did prove the naysayers wrong. He was hugely beloved, and when the accounts of his funeral in 1910 are pretty remarkable. Sort of, they're talking about people, sort of crowds, hundreds deep to watch the funeral procession.
Yeah, I wonder who King Charles III kind of looks up to, because I know he's a keen study of history and royal history. So there must be some figures, I can't think of any at the moment. You've pulled out some excellent examples really there of people that he maybe could really use as inspiration in his.
And also one of the things, history is not just the great comparison, it's the great warning. Sometimes one of the things that institutions like the monarchy have is that it can provide you with people that you don't want to be like.
Okay.
And people that you should really, really avoid.
Okay.
George IV is usually cited as the one that you do not want to be as king from 1820 to 1830, and wildly extravagant, and he sort of was the reverse of Charles. George IV started out as the golden boy, and everyone loved him, and he sort of ate, drank, and slept his way away from that. As was really probably the closest Britain's come to being a republic was that period in the 1820s with George IV. Another example is like James II in the 1680s. He was very, very stubborn, and he's usually cited as an example of if you don't bend with the wind, you can be uprooted by it completely. I think he is a very keen reader of history. The Duchess of Sussex, actually, interestingly, when she married into the family, she mentioned that Charles spoke to her quite a lot about the family history and explained who was who in the portraits. He also takes art very seriously, and that's part and parcel of the imagery and the history of the monarchy. So I do think I think he's very aware, very, very aware of the history of the institution he's inheriting.
What about William? Because he's the heir to the. There's been so many heirs over the years. I mean, he's not in the same situation as his father was. But could you see any resemblance with William with past historical figures?
Well, he has two things, or maybe two and a half, that mark him out as different in a positive way. The first is that it has been it's been quite a long time since there has been an heir, a Prince of Wales, who was known to be the next in line and who was happily married.
Right.
There was the future Elizabeth II was the Duchess of Edinburgh. Charles had a period where he was married to Diana, and then obviously it fell apart very dramatically. So you're going back to really his great-great-grandfather George V is the last one of whom you can say that with his wife, Princess Mary, future Queen Mary. The other things that I think are really interesting, just from a historian's perspective, and I think probably from yours as well, of seeing where it will go in the future, is who his mentors were, his political mentor and his emotional mentor.
Right.
So, we know that William had a great amount of time with his grandmother, Elizabeth II. She would have lunches with him. They would speak together often, and she did try to explain the mechanics of the institution he will lead. And learning about the mechanics of monarchy from Elizabeth II must be like learning about music from Mozart. In that sense, he's had a great deal of political and constitutional mentoring from a very successful, very popular monarch, who I would say was sort of a conservative figure with a small c, not in any way linked to the political party, but did not believe in radical change for its sake within the monarchy. One of his emotional mentors, of course, was his late mother. And I think people often tend to forget that, because in the same way we tend to slot the Princess of Wales and the Duchess of Sussex into these historical archetypes, we've kind of done the same with the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex. We now see William as Charles's son and Harry as Diana's son, and we sort of forget where they have similarities to the other parent. William was immensely close to his mother, and Diana was someone who was more of a radical royal compared to Elizabeth II. So he has these two very different influences, and that I think makes him exciting as a future king, because potentially, if he welds those two legacies of the sort of the willingness to change that Diana had, but the enthusiasm for tradition that Elizabeth II had, he could prove, I think, hugely successful as King William V.
That's fascinating. I've never really pieced that together in my mind when you combine, the qualities of Charles and the qualities of Diana. I know you'd say that Harry often gets, he often talks about his mother more than William does, I think. But when I see William on jobs, up close, he does remind me of Diana. Although I never saw Diana actually on an engagement, he does, the way he speaks to people, the way his eyes move, the way he moves his head, he actually has more of a resemblance, I think, than Harry does. The way he acts with people as well, generally, it's something that doesn't really get picked up on, but I notice it so often. I think he acts like Diana when he's with children and when he's with people.
You're not. I've heard that from other people before, that actually he has that kind. Yeah, that's interesting.
It's that little glint.
Yeah, it's something about the movement of the head as well. Apparently, I've heard that.
But he has that kind of affection, that kind of authenticity when he talks to people that he actually, they like him.
Do you think? I mean, this is your area of expertise, because I don't really know what I think of this. Do you think it translates onto camera with William, or do you think it's more impressive when you see it in person?
He's bigger than you think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you have to see him in person. I think people come away. There's often a thrill, like meeting a rock star and when you meet a royal. But when he's spoken to people on walkabouts, and that the people that have actually met him face to face, that they've had an incredible time, and you can tell they're almost speechless. And I think you're right. I think it translates better when it's face to face. On camera, it might be more difficult to spot. But I look forward to more jobs with William, and I'll tell you all about them next time we meet. But yeah, honestly, he does come across more like Diana.
It's so interesting. That's really interesting.
Finally, though, your book obviously about. You are the Queen Mother expert, basically.
That's right.
You are the Queen Mother expert, and there's a wonderful book you've written about the Queen Mother. Can you tell us your favourite stories? I don't want to put you under pressure or under the spotlight, but you're a big fan of the Queen Mother.
But
you're not just a fan, but obviously a biographer. What are your highlights of her life? Whether they're funny, whether they're sad, or impactful on society?
Yeah, do you know, it's funny when you spend that amount of time with people spectrally when you're writing about them, and then by the end of it, you're like, I need you to leave me alone, and I need to never see your name again. And I didn't really feel that way with her. I actually ended up admiring her a lot more emerging from it, than I had going into it. And the book, Let's Have Another Drink, is like 101 anecdotes from one chapter per decade of her life. And I think some of the stuff about, just what she went through in the First World War, and the brothers that one was killed in the trenches, two had PTSD, one had alcoholism, one was a POW, and this really moving letter that she writes when she says, I was 17 years old and I thought I will never be happy again. And she said every day you heard someone died. And I think that explains a little bit of when she could seem steelier and tough. And it's not just her, it's that generation. You know, you can't really empathise with sort of the touchy-feeliness of the 80s and 90s when you grew up every day hearing someone else had been blown apart in the trenches. There were some great stories about her. I can't. One of them involves swearing, so I can't say it. But she was at Balmoral, and they were out, and there was sort of one of the little booths that they were going to, and one of the Queen had forgotten to bring the key, even though the Queen Mother had said bring it, and they were it was raining down on all of them, and there was a ghillie inside. So they tried to open the door, and the ghillie shouted, "Who the F is it?" The Queen Mother trilled, "Don't worry, it's only the Queen." The ghillie sort of launched himself to get it done. The one that's probably most famous, I think people enjoy, is that she had on her staff two gay men who were on again, off again boyfriends, and they were on getting to off stage, and they were arguing, and they forgot to bring the Queen Mother her drink, and she sailed out, you know, a waft of pastels, and she said, "When you two old queens have finished fighting, will you get this old queen her drink?" So she had a good sense of humour. She was just remarkable. I mean, I liked her. I mean, she certainly, I think, was tough, really, really tough. And as I said, I don't think that's necessarily to her demerit, but she was utterly fascinating to write about, Matt. She really was.
Well, it's interesting because she's often forgotten now. With all the characters that we have, you know, with Harry and Meghan and the Princess of Wales, she's someone that has such a huge, important role. You know, saw everything happen over her lifetime and was right there at the front seat. It's good that, you know, she is remembered. But listen, Gareth, thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
I've had a pleasure. We've made history.
We've
covered a lot of stuff, so I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. That's all we have time for this week, but thank you for watching. If you like the show, please let us know in the comments and subscribe for more royal content.